So, my talk today will be about how bilingual Belgians, so probably all of you, I assume that many of you would consider yourself at least in some way to be bilingual, reshape the French language. With as a subtitle, Germanic-Romance language contacts and Pippinid prestige. Just like a quick overview, do any of you know who the Pippinids are, were, etc.? Want to have the story? If there were any historians, they probably would have known. But don't worry about it, we'll get to the Pippinids once we'll get to them. But let's first take you back to a country torn apart by invasion, civil war, hunger, pestilence, a very nasty place. And this was Roman Gaul, of course also including Belgium back in the day, in the second half of the 5th century. At that time, the Roman border defenses had been abandoned. Both the Roman border in the Netherlands at the River Rhine and later the Roman border that ran straight through Belgium. At that time, warlords ruled the countryside. So we shouldn't be thinking about emperors from Rome ruling Belgium, ruling the north of France. No, at this time, anyone who could muster up an army was in charge. And yeah, it was a bad time to just be a regular person, to be a commoner. If we can believe the sources, many of them were enslaved and killed at random. A taste of what life was like back there in Roman Gaul in the 5th century we find in a text, the Querus Sive Aulularia, which you could kind of translate like grumpy and pot of gold. And it's a play, so we must be a little bit careful with trying to say something definitive about what was going on, but we can get a taste. Like, it must have been recognizable at least. And the way they sketch regular life is in the following way. We are dealing with two people talking to each other, and the one really pissed off the other one, and the one guy says, "Well, go, live at the River Loire. Men live there under the law of barbarians. There is no trickery there. Capital sentences are performed on the oak tree and written on bones. There are even peasants perorate, and common folk pronounce judgments. You can do anything you like there." This is from the perspective of someone from the south of France, from Lyon, talking about everything that happens to the north of the River Loire. He says it's a nasty place, like that's where civilization ends. Eventually, in the 5th century, order returned. Amid the flames of the 5th century, the Franks, a Germanic-speaking people from Belgium and the Netherlands and part of Western Germany, subjugated the last Gallo-Roman warlords, and they claimed dominion over Roman Gaul, to such an extent even that Roman Gaul is no longer called Gaul, but France, literally the kingdom of the Franks. And in this period, the Latin of post-Roman Gaul evolved away from the other Romance languages in a fashion that has striking parallels in the neighboring Germanic languages, in the neighboring Germanic dialects. And this has been a very striking thing for many scholars ever since the 19th century. Especially because there seems to be something going on a dialectal level within France itself. The Romance language of Northern Gaul, Northern French, which later became French, in many ways sides way more with the Germanic dialects on the other side of the border than the dialects of Southern French. So that's Southern France, which later became Provençal. So French, and then we're talking about the Gallo-Romance dialects to the north of the River Loire, they contain a significant amount of Germanic Frankish loanwords. That's one way in which French is different from the other Gallo-Romance dialects. French has been recognized to contain quite a lot of Germanic-like features in syntax. And more importantly, at least more recognizably, French contains Germanic-like features in phonology and prosody. If you hear someone speak Spanish, and if you hear someone speak Italian, at least you can recognize a lot of the same prosody, a lot of the same phonotactics. A lot of the masculine words end in O, a lot of the feminine words end in A. It's all very recognizable. But if you go to the north of the River Loire, you see that a lot of stuff that used to be full vowels in Latin just collapsed into schwa. Just like in many Germanic languages. Everything that's unstressed collapsed into schwa. We'll talk more about that later. So, this actually is a long-standing problem in Romance linguistics. That the north of France, the dialects of the north of France, do so much in common with Germanic. Is this due to language contact? What role, if any, did Germanic-Romance language contact play in the early evolution of the French language? But if there is there such an influence, can we attribute it to a specific period? So, does this have to do with the migration age? Does this have to do with Charlemagne? Does this have to do maybe even with late medieval trade, etc.? These questions have been revisited many, many times over in the 19th and in the 20th century. So what I want to do with you today, this evening, first I want to sketch the problem and revisit some of the basic facts about migration and the French language. Like, what are we actually dealing with? What is the data? I'm going to give you an overview of some of the things that people have claimed are Germanic-like in the French language. And in the second half of this presentation, I want to talk about some possible solutions. And those solutions actually are going to take us to Belgium. The solution I have tentatively called the Pippinid hypothesis. And we'll be talking about Walloon as a border dialect. So when I'm talking about Walloon, of course I'm talking about the dialect Walloon. I'm not talking about the French that's spoken in Belgium today, which mostly is not the dialect. And Walloon, as we will see later on, actually has a big role to play in what I think is a crucial moment in the early history of French. And of course I will conclude with a conclusion. Just very, very shortly, if at any point you have like a very burning question, like a question that you really want to ask, just go ahead. Like, if it's something that can be solved quickly, I will do it right there and then. And if it's something that will need more discussion, then we can do it after the talk. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. As I already stated, Gaul is no longer known as Gaul, now it's known as France. So from Gaul to Francia, what exactly happened? In the mid-5th century, the Franks, who were living first in Belgium, they infiltrated northern Gaul. And in the last decades of the 5th century, they expanded their dominion to the river Loire. The Franks, they became the kings of the new post-Roman kingdom. And since they became the kings and the counts and the dukes, they also brought along a lot of the, at least some of the linguistic traditions that they used to have back in Belgium, the Netherlands and Germany. For example, how to name your children. They brought along a Germanic naming fashion in France that would last for almost the entire Middle Ages. So if you've ever read the Chanson de Roland, everyone who is a noble has a Germanic name. And that's not a coincidence. That directly goes back to the times of Clovis, of the Franks. Also important to note is that the Frankish language, that language of the Franks who came from Belgium and took over France, was the direct ancestor of present-day Dutch. And in a certain way also a part of Western German, but mostly Dutch. It's good to claim it for ourselves at least. An interesting part of this whole story about the Frankish takeover actually resides in place names, and we can see them up to the present day. So, settlement names in Ingum, so we're talking of course about the 6th century, 5th, 6th century settlement names in Ingum and in Heim, probably belong to the 5th century CE. These settlement names nowadays are still visible just in the landscape in the Dutch place names in Ingen and in and of course in Flanders in the Gem place names, which are all over the place here. Bevergem, Evergem, Wondelgem, Wombelgem, I don't know. Many Gem names here around Ghent. And when you take a look at the distribution of these place names, when you just plot them on the map, what quickly becomes visible is that, here, I have a cursor, that's good, is that there seems to be a line, which we can call the Somme-Ain line, to the north of which actually Germanic place names outnumber Gallo-Romance or Celtic ones. So they predominate there. As you can see, even in Bologna there are more Germanic place names than there are Celtic or Romance ones. This, according at least to traditional Old Germanicist philologists, actually tells us something important about what happened there, about history. At the other side, so now we're going further south, at the River Loire there is a ribbon of Germanic place names whose meaning actually suggests that they have that they must have had some kind of military function. Those place names are place names that end in an Old Germanic word called werki, which of course we still have in Dutch as verdedigingswerken or something like that. So werki meant fortress. And you have them all over here the River Loire, but also a little bit here bordering what we call the Breton March, like the border between Brittany and central France. And such a naming fashion that is so concentrated really suggests that they all must have been coined in a relatively small time window. It seems likely that the Frankish takeover reinforced the River Loire as a cultural border between northern and southern Gaul. So it seems likely that this is actually a trace of the Franks who moved in the 5th century. They came at the River Loire and said, hey, this is where we'll have a border. So here we will found a couple of settlements that are specifically meant to be military settlements. And they did that at the River Loire, they also did that at the Breton March. So this way and this way. So the River Loire plays a big role. That brings us to the problem of the rift between French and Provençal. Because the border between French and Provençal largely coincides with the border of the 6th century Frankish Empire, and thereby also largely coincides with that River Loire. Older scholarship took this as evidence of a sizable Frankish colonization, especially the Germans, of course. The Germans in the early 20th century, they said, well, this actually proves that France was basically founded by Germans. Of course, they said that the Franks were Germans. I'm Dutch, so I would say that the Franks are Belgian or Dutch. And those German philologists, they said, well, the definitive proof comes from the Germanic toponyms in the north of Gaul. Are there any questions about this story so far? So we've talked about a couple of things. We've talked about the end of the Roman Empire. We talked about the 5th century being a miserable time to be alive, especially when you lived in the north of Gaul. We talked about the Franks coming from Belgium and the Netherlands, swooping in, trying to get rid of the last Romans, and eventually founding the Roman kingdom. They were very influential. They built their new villages all over the north, up to the Somme-Ain line. They also built some new villages right there at the River Loire, which fits this old story that the Franks took dominion of Gaul up to the River Loire. So, how does that directly relate to the question of the dialectal split in Gallo-Romance? So here we have a map of the different Gallo-Romance dialects. As some of you might be aware, those of the north are also known as the Languedoc, and those of the south are also known as the Languedoc. Dui is just a way to say yes in Old French. So that's the ancestor of oui in modern French. So in the Middle Ages they said, in the north they said oui this way, in the south they said oui that way. That was kind of the distinction that they made. Nowadays, for example, we would take Poitevin with the Languedoc, but we know that in the Middle Ages people didn't do that. That Poitevin was still part of the Languedoc. So this is everything that's marked orange can be considered French, at least from a modern perspective. Everything that's white cannot be considered French, at least from this dialectal perspective. And if we put the map of the Merovingian Empire next to it, at least there is some significant overlap. So here we have the River Loire, Nantes, etc. Goes all the way there, etc. So this is where the Frankish kings ruled in the 6th century. This is the modern dialect map. At least in the 20th century, that inspired a lot of people to come up with what is also known as the Frankish Superstrate hypothesis. So those, especially the Germans in the 20th century, they said that the presence of a Frankish bilingual ruling class in Merovingian Gaul was instrumental in consolidating the border between French and Provençal. So they said those Franks who originally spoke a Germanic language, an early ancestor of Dutch, the fact that they took dominion of the north of Gaul was very important in actually breaking French apart from Provençal. Because Provençal is generally just a very normal Romance language. It looks a lot like Italian, it looks a lot like Catalan, it looks a lot like Spanish. It's really just French that's weird. So, that was the philologist talk, the philologist perspective on what must have happened, especially the early 20th century philologist perspective. This story, this narrative, became more problematic after the war. And actually more so even in the late 20th century, from the 1970s onward. The historians nowadays, also historians here in Ghent, I have a good colleague here in Ghent, Jeroen Weijendalen, who has published many books, well, 2 books on this, who very violently disagrees with everything I'm saying here, so it's very good to keep that perspective. And their story is different. And what they would say is that there was great continuity between Roman Gaul and Merovingian Gaul. They would say like that dramatic story that I just told you about all the warfare and misery, etc. It was not that bad. A lot of the elements of Roman Gaul survived. The city walls of Tongeren are still visible nowadays. Like, it was not such a bad time after all. They also say that if there was ever a Frankish colonization, it must have been very limited. And more importantly for us, they said that the Franks regarded the Gallo-Romans as the more prestigious culture. So the Franks who moved into the Roman Empire, they were like, wow, Romans, they are so awesome, we should do everything like the Romans. Here, by the way, we have a sigil ring of Childeric. Childeric was one of the early kings of the Franks. He was the father of Clovis, who was the main conqueror of France. He was buried in Tournai, in Doornik. And on this ring, he actually portrayed himself kind of like a Roman emperor. The inscription also is in Latin, Childerici Regis. So this is what the historians would say. He would say like, hey, look at this. Childeric really tried to present himself as a Roman ruler. So what does this have to do with our story? The historians would say that the Franks would have quickly abandoned their heritage culture because they were looking to Rome so much, and that they would have assimilated into the Gallo-Romans receiving population as quick as possible. This paradigm, this story, was long supported by archaeologists. Archaeologists in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s were very, very hesitant to say anything about folk migrations. That was a story that many archaeologists just didn't like so much. If there was any kind of discontinuity, they tried to explain it away by just talking about trading, about what is it, like anything that's not migration, more or less. Okay, so the historians, they had a problem with the old philologist paradigm story narrative of the Franks being so important in breaking French away from Provençal. The Romanists, the linguists, they of course had to do something with that. They reacted to that in the late 20th century. So the later Romanists, they actually said, well, those historians, they might be on the right track. They might be right. And many later Romanists, many linguists, they said, well, they might be right, and there's that Germanic Superstrate hypothesis, we should be very, very critical of that. So most Romanists nowadays would also say that there was only a limited Frankish colonization. And they would argue that just like the historians, that the Franks were very much focused on Gallo-Romance prestige, so that the Franks were also shifted from Frankish to Gallo-Romance, to the language that the Gallo-Romans were speaking, probably within a couple of generations. This argument can be succinctly summarized by Marius Sala in the Cambridge History of the Romance Languages. And he said, how would imperfect use of a language more prestigious than Frankish? So this is really about the Franks coming in with their heavy Dutch-like accents, and that way having such a big influence on the later evolution of the Latin in Gaul. He said, how would imperfect use of a language more prestigious than Frankish have been so keenly imitated by the great mass of Romance native speakers, especially when it's reasonable to believe that the Franks themselves would have been at pains to learn Latin Romance as correctly as possible. So he's saying any kind of accent that the Franks might have had in their Latin would not have been prestigious, so none of the Romans there in Gaul would have wanted to imitate it. So how could it have been so influential in the first place? This is not plausible, according to Marius Sala. So let's deconstruct that a little bit. Basically what it comes down to, for the Romanists, from the linguistic side from the linguistic perspective, is that no West Frankish vernacular survived between Somme and Loire. So like really in the north of France. The moment when the French started writing their own languages. So in the 9th century we have the Sermon de Strasbourg, and apparently people realized that they could write in another language besides Latin. And at that moment no one was writing in Dutch in Paris. Everyone was only writing either in Latin or in French. And sometimes even in Old German, but never in something Frankish like we have in Belgium and in the Netherlands. So, according to Romanists, this would prove the relatively small amount of Frankish newcomers, this would prove the greater prestige of Gallo-Romance, and this would prove an early Frankish to Gallo-Romance language shift. And I think there are two problems with this scenario, with this new revisionist Romanist perspective. Problem one, I think, is what exactly was the demographic balance between Germanic-speaking newcomers and Gallo-Roman-speaking receiving population there in the north of Gaul? And I think the answer should be that we do not know, because archaeology does not provide a clear answer, and neither do the written sources. And I think the second problem is that there is a big gap between the late 5th century, when we know those Franks came in, and the early 9th century, when our first written documents in French turn up. And I think this leaves us at least a good three and a half centuries for the Frankish ruling class to have held on to their ancestral in-group language. So even though I would say that the Franks, for example, might have talked Gallo-Romance / Dialectal Latin with the senators or with the bishops, I think it would be very logical that if their family spoke Frankish, that they still would have held on to Frankish as an in-group language within their Frankish community. This brings us to the topic of language contact. And there are a couple of, let's say, terms that we quickly have to go through. A couple belong to the traditional model. So, matrix language, that's the language under investigation that may have undergone context-induced change. A superstrate language, that's a linguistic variety within a society that has more social prestige than the matrix language. If you have context, if you have like influence from a superstrate language, you would expect, according to Camille Scheck in the traditional model, to mainly be dealing with loanwords. A substrate language, that's a linguistic variety within a society that has less social prestige than the matrix language. If that is the context situation, according to Camille Scheck, then you would expect mainly structural copies. And an adstrate language, that is basically when you have language contact between two varieties that have roughly equal social prestige. Nowadays, any discussion about language contact is mainly dominated by two seminal works, Thomason and Kaufman and Van Cutsem. And what both of them really stress is these terms, L1 and L2. Although they kind of have a different idea of what L1 and L2 is. So L1, let's just say it's the linguistically dominant language. That means it's not necessarily the socially dominant language. L1 can often be identified with the native language. It is also very often the emblematic identity-giving language. But its use can be relatively restricted to communications within the in-group. And L2 is the linguistically dominated language. It's often the language that you do not learn as your mother language, but the language that you acquire secondarily. It is often just used as a communication language. For example, English in Belgium and in the Netherlands is an L2. Its use can be restricted to communication within the outgroup. So, how does this help us? Let's go back to the story about how French is different from the other Romance languages. So we've already said French contains a significant amount of Germanic and French loanwords. We've already discussed that French contains Germanic-like features in syntax. And French also just sounds more Germanic-like in terms of phonology and prosody. What kind of evidence do we have for this? Well, let's first take a look at the lexical part. When we take a look at both the North and the South, we have to admit that both Provençal and French exhibit loanwords that belong to elite semantic domains. So those are loanwords that have to do with warfare, with the administration of justice, with hunting, with societal hierarchy. And as you can imagine, that those are just very natural words to borrow when your ruling lord, when your count, when your duke brings those words with you. And those are the words that as a peasant you would adopt because that's what your count, duke, etc. is using. There are also a couple of other terms that we might be a little bit more careful about with grouping them with elite semantic domains. An interesting thing about basically all the Romance languages is that almost all the color terms in the Romance languages are Germanic. Why? The interesting problem.